Hi there. As I promised yesterday, I'm going to switch my attention for a little while to the science. One intuition I've had my whole life is that spiritual truth and scientific truth are merging, or at least it appeared that way to me. I'll still throw in the occasional quote from A Course in Miracles to show you just how these two parallel lines, or these two avenues of truth-seeking, do appear to merge in the distance, as parallel lines do in perception. Here's one from Chapter 6 that is simply irresistible to share. Quote, "The ego prefers to believe that parallel lines do not meet, and conceives of their meeting as impossible. But you might remember that even the human eye perceives them as if they do meet in the distance, which is the same as in the future, if time and space are one dimension." The later mathematics supports the interpretation of the ultimate convergence of the parallel theoretically. Everything meets in God because everything was created by him and in him. God created his sons by extending his thought and retaining the extensions of his thought in his mind. All his thoughts are thus perfectly united within themselves and with each other because they were created neither partially nor in part. End quote. Donald Hoffman, a cognitive scientist and tenured professor at the University of California, Irvine, wrote a book several years ago called The Case Against Reality. In his book, he carefully lays out his interface theory of consciousness. He and his graduate students were working with John Maynard Smith's evolutionary game theory, which has been established by most evolutionary scientists today as a mathematically precise algorithm for predicting whether certain traits would be favorable to have according to natural selection. I don't understand the math precisely myself, so I'll leave it to the mathematicians to check his work. But back to the story. He and his graduate students posed the following question into the evolutionary game theory algorithm. What is the probability that any sensory system of any organism which sees the veridical truth, an accurate representation of what is really there, would be favored by natural selection over another sensory system that doesn't see the truth? The algorithm said there is basically a zero probability. To explain this, he uses the interface of our computers as metaphor. He's making a parallel between our perception and our perceptions of our desktop. If you see a blue folder on your desktop, say it's in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, it doesn't represent a blue folder located inside your computer in the same location. No, it's a pixelated representation of a blue folder. The truth is that there's a lot of bytes being toggled and binary events happening inside the computer to render the appearance of a blue folder on your computer screen. And it was designed this way to simplify the process for the user. He asks us to imagine a game of Grand Theft Auto. In this thought experiment, you're playing against an opponent who has a joystick to play the game with and to react to the images that appear on the screen with, as is the case with all players of Grand Theft Auto, I think. You, on the other hand, have your computer splayed open to see the truth about it. You have access to all those toggles and switches and bytes or whatever is going on in there. So the question is, who's going to score more points and win the game? Well, obviously your opponent will, because they are using the dumbed-down version by way of the interface. You're probably not going to figure out how to get your car even to start moving as you try to figure out how to manipulate all these little bits of silica or whatever they are. Natural selection is all about scoring points too. So he is using this metaphor to help us get our heads around a very abstract idea that our perception of the world is dumbed down so that we see the things that will aid us in surviving long enough to pass our genes along to the next generation. Fitness payoffs are sort of like the currency of evolutionary game theory. For instance, if in the moment the individual organism is hungry, a fitness payoff would be some food. If instead they're wanting to mate, a member of the opposite sex would be the fitness payoff. So where this all gets back around to is the idea that seeing the truth of what is there would never be a good fitness payoff. Well, how could that be? Well, the truth about atoms, as anyone who is paying attention in their elementary school science class knows, is that they're comprised of 99.99999999999 empty space. That's 13 nines, by the way. If we saw that truth with our eyes, we wouldn't be brave enough to even walk across the ground, which is entirely composed of atoms, to get the food, which is itself comprised entirely of atoms, which are themselves composed mostly of empty space. That is, if you agree with me that 99.9999999999999% qualifies as mostly. So I've shared a couple of YouTube links in the More section of today's presentation to introduce you to Donald Hoffman. See it for yourself. There's a fairly concise TED Talk that is fairly digestible, and a longer interview with him where he gets more into the weeds of the science and also helps us understand how we might apply this to our lives. Both here today and in my book, How to Change the World by Changing Your Mind, I'm speaking directly to those of you who believe science is real. I'm appealing to you that if you pay attention to what the leading edge of science is discovering about the nature of perception and reality, you might better understand how the parallel lines of science and spirituality do indeed merge in the future. And the sooner we realize the truth, which they are both pointing to, the sooner we can get on with the business of accepting joy and peace into our hearts again. I will do my best to show my work, to explain the dots I'm connecting, to get from accepting an abstract scientific hypothesis like Donald Hoffman's can result in accepting joy and peace as your natural inheritance. So please stay with me.